Sylvia Agbih with me, but she is still to join. But we also have Zeliha Öcek. Zeliha Öcek is from LMU Munich, and Sylvia Agbih is from Faculty of Medicine, Augsburg University. And we are going to talk mainly about social resilience. But Sylvia will join whenever she would be available. But we can start with Zeliha. Is it okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, Zeliha, you already have research in this area, and I have seen your researches, particularly with reference to social resilience. And you have also done the work on the precariousness and vulnerability studies. So how do you see, if I ask you to define or frame social resilience in your research, where will you connect it with precariousness, and how do you see social resilience in your research?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it's a good point that starting to discuss the social resilience with precariousness and with vulnerability. And the first concept I would like to talk about very shortly is precariousness. This is defined as a dangerous lack of security or stability, dependence of uncertain developments, or dependence on the will of others. And there are lots of components: income, employment, housing, access to food, and the enjoyment of civil, economic, or social rights. They are all parts of components of precariousness, but they are all working together. And all these elements are actually the results of political, economical, and social structures that can lead injustice and inequity among citizens. And that's why this is a very structured and political issue, actually, precariousness. And the other concept is, the second term is vulnerability. It's not so much clear, such as precariousness, because it's very debatable, and it's an actually elastic concept. Why? Because of the elasticity of the meaning, one may dismiss that the fact that vulnerability is frequently constructed by states or other actors that are shaping our life or the society's life. And employing this term may sometimes serve to portray people as helpless and weak victims, and that for them we should feel sorry. And the concept of precariousness, on the other side, separates the qualification from the individual and indicates that much of the vulnerability is policy-driven, it's the structure-driven. And however, the categorization of vulnerability based on its source removes this confusion or this elasticity a little bit, or not little bit, very openly. For example, we can begin with the first category: temporary or permanent physical or cognitive characteristics of a person, such as disabilities, chronic illness, pregnancy, that are intrinsic to human condition are referred to as inherent vulnerability. And so, as I said, children, elderly people, pregnant women, people with disability, they are particularly sensitive to harm due to their inherent characteristics. And if we have a crisis situation, for example, a natural disaster, an earthquake, or a war conflict situation, they have the priority for assistance during these emergency times. Nevertheless, the extent, they have a vulnerability, intrinsic vulnerability. Nevertheless, the extent of this vulnerability is shaped actually by the social and political context in which they live. And for example, as you said, we made a study research in Munich on the effects of COVID-19 pandemic. And one of our groups were people with disabilities, and we made interviews with them. And people with disabilities who used to work in supported, before the pandemic, in supported workshops, and who were living in groups with people who are with disabilities, but also without disabilities. And the people without disabilities were supporting people with disabilities, and also with with disabilities who were supported in daily activities, with shopping or with legal issues. And they faced actually coping difficulties at the beginning of the pandemic. But however, following the first initial shock, then the recovery process began very shortly, and the workshops were opened as soon as possible. Maybe not a regular basis, but they continued to support people, and their social life could continue because they were already living together. They had already a social life in their houses, and also they received support for shopping at their home, and some had additional family support, strong family support, and they were vaccinated in their workshops as the first ones during when vaccination was available. And this showed us that the level of vulnerability of people with disabilities, in this case disabilities, depends on the social support and inclusion mechanisms that were already existed before the pandemic, period the pandemic. And as a result, while physical disability is an inherent vulnerability, it does not necessarily make a person less resilient to crisis. They were actually resilient to crisis. But because of these mechanisms, what matters is that he or she, the person, has social resilience mechanisms in place, and that these mechanisms, very importantly, can demonstrate continuity. And another categorization of vulnerability, we should discuss vulnerability very deeply, and I hope we can have time for this. Another categorization of vulnerability is structural vulnerability, and this is arising from injustice in social, political, economic, and environmental structures. And this category includes domains such as financial security, residence in all areas of life, risk environments, access to food, legal status, your legal status if you are a migrant in the country, in the host country, education, or if you are facing discrimination or not. And this classification, this structural vulnerability classification, allows us to say that a person's physical conditions make him or her inherently vulnerable. However, if this person is excluded from society as a result of this condition, disability or migration status, and is unable to benefit the opportunities that other people have in their lives, there's a structural issue. And that's why it's important, this structural issue. And those whose lives are more vulnerable to structural vulnerability are also frequently precarious, and they have fewer resources to rely on their resilience. These support mechanisms, they were financed by the states. That's why they are important. They are not just social networks or not informal networks. They are supported by non-governmental organizations, but they are financed by the states, and that's why they could survive. And that's why they are so very well established. And for example, some of the people with disabilities, they had very strong family support, but some of them for some of them, families are not present, or they are tired, or they are not enough to support them. And also for the migrants, this solidarity and this informal social relations, they are very important. But if they are all victims of the crisis, they are not working, then you need the state, or maybe, how do you call it, public, but it should be an organized establishment. Extremely important how everything is and organized, how the state makes access to resources without or with barriers. This is important first. And so as I see that the vulnerability and also the resilience, two parts, that the part is barriers, and the other part is if there is an instruct vulnerability, how the state supports people who are facing the inherent vulnerabilities. And that's both of them are the responsibilities of the states. I learned lots of things from the literature, and I can give some references. For example, there are lots of articles actually on vulnerability and on resilience, but the article on Valerie Preston, John Shields, and Marisha Akbar, which is titled Migration and Resilience in Urban Canada, and which was published in Journal of Integration and Migration and Integration, I learned a lot from the article, and I can recommend this. And I will answer this question with what I learned from this article, and also from my experience from my research. And yeah, with resilience, actually, I don't mean someone's healthy physical or cognitive condition or very strong character that make easier for him or her to overcome challenges. Of course, this is also very important, and of course, each person should have individual resilience, and this individual resilience should be developed. But this is not my focus, and I don't think that. Yeah, it's something important, but I'm not going to talk about this. And also, on the other hand, we should also be aware on the misuse of this individual resilience. And for example, the socio-ecological resilience approach, which I'm criticizing, considers how individuals, communities, or even cities respond to external dangers and the self-recover mechanisms. But on the other hand, is it useful to place a big emphasis on personal or community resilience in an environment dominated by precariousness and dominated by structural vulnerability mechanisms? Can we talk about on this situation on personal resilience when they are present? Or let me give an example from my original country, from Turkey. And can we talk about community resilience in a country where an earthquake destroys an entire town which is composed of unsafe buildings that are built because of political corruption? Can we talk about the resilience of the citizens if this kind of structural vulnerability with a crisis coming together? And there are amazing resilience stories for communities or for individuals but they may also blind us to the source of inequalities. These stories give the message, oh, you can succeed. It's the big American dream. Like, if you really want, it's not impossible, you can solve it. And then it's going to that point, okay, this is your problem because it's not impossible to solve and you must solve it. And I think this neoliberal resilience approach and the related process of individual responsibilization of the resilience opens space for yet more pressure on people. And then the states, as you said, the state is important, and the states and the system's responsibilities are not anymore on the agenda. Rather, it's always the individual's responsibility. For example, let's talk about the immigrants. They are constantly blamed for their failure to integrate or to learn healthcare systems, and it's their individual responsibility, as according to this perspective. Yeah, we know that even a very extraordinary resilience cannot overcome institutional inequalities and power dynamics, power relations, and the barriers that to the resources that are caused by structural inequalities are far beyond the coping capabilities of individuals or groups. On the contrary, critical social resilience approach takes us to the root causes of vulnerabilities, inequalities, and this approach addresses institutional inequalities and power relationships that shape people's capacities to obtain resources, especially during crises, such as the pandemic. And this resilience, the critical resilience approach, propose a move from the individualistic focus to a collective idea. And when we are talking, my subject on migrants, critical social resilience approach emphasizes that institutional support in newcomers' efforts to create their lives, especially when faced an unexpected events such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So in summary, conclusion, I understand social resilience or resilience as the absence of mechanisms that cause societies to be unequal, with some people benefiting and others being precarious or vulnerable, and people on the other side, and people who are inherently vulnerable. And I think migration is also a kind of inherent vulnerability because you are in a totally new environment, and that's people who are inherently vulnerable should never be left behind, never be left alone and should be supported by social and publicly financed mechanisms.
All right, thank you very much. And I just thought about the migrants because I was studying migrants and with reference to social resilience. What do you think that why migrants are? You said they are inherently vulnerable when they are living in a country for maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Do you think that the time spent in the country, in the host countries, it may help to address their vulnerabilities?
Yeah, of course, the process of migration is very long, and it begins with the pre-migration and people like on the move process. And these processes are also having still their effects when you are able to come a country where you can be very, very comfortable and you can have all the comfort support mechanisms. We should, because of this process, before process, we should think that they have still inherent vulnerability. And also, if they face structural vulnerability mechanisms such as discrimination, when they are looking to a house for rent, and then they are in the first stage eliminated because of their family names, then it means they are still a victim of the structural vulnerability mechanisms. That's why it can, of course, it can start in the first years, but it can have effects during the whole life of a migrant, or if you are born in the country with migrant parents. It depends also on these structural mechanisms.
Yes, all right. And at the right time, actually, Sylvia joined us. Welcome, Sylvia.
Hi, Sylvia.
Thank you. Hello. Sorry, I hope I'm not disturbing, but you encouraged me to join whenever I arrive. So
Yes, you're welcome. And you have joined us at the very right time. And we are already continuing with this session. And actually, we were talking about the vulnerability. And that is where your entry was right at the time, because I was asking Zeliha that vulnerability, how do we see it when we consider migrants in a host country? And does it make any sense that being a migrant in a host country for 4, 5, 6, 7 years can change vulnerability for them, or it remains inherent with them? So, but you can start with the concept of vulnerability, please.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much for this chance to have this conversation with you. And if you ask me about the concept of vulnerability, I mean, it's a concept that is, in a way, it sounds like something that's very clear. We can all imagine something, but at the same time, it has, you know, there are very different ways of conceptualizing it in very different types of, let's say, areas. So one is science and research, but it's also being used like in catastrophe aid and for aid organizations. You know, there are like concepts of vulnerability that are supposed to help in a very practical sense, you know, in choosing whom you help first in a way. And then there is, of course, the whole political area and political discourse or social policies, you know, that also work with concepts of vulnerability. So it's a highly, in many ways, contested and difficult concept. And there's not the one concept of vulnerability. There are very many different types of understandings and of conceptualizations. And I'm beginning to think that maybe this is not only a problem, maybe this is actually necessary to define vulnerability or vulnerabilities in different ways and have different concepts and operationalizations, depending on what you're aiming at, depending on what the question is, depending on what the need is, and depending on what you talk about. But I think some very, basic problems with the term or with the concept are attached to the question, who is defining vulnerability for who, you know? So do I, as a researcher, for example, when I work in the context of health and migration, do I then define who is vulnerable? And from which perspective do I do this? Do I reflect my own position in this? And why do I think that others are vulnerable? And why do I think I can attach this label to people? Would I say about myself that I'm vulnerable or not? You know, so that's, I think that these are questions that are related to power, to social positions. And then we are very quickly in discussions about social justice, actually. You know, I'm coming from the point of view of ethics. So I'm familiar with the discussion on vulnerability more in ethics, and especially also ethics concerning health and health equity. And there we find that, I think we also have to look at questions of what I still overheard what Zeliha, what you said about structural injustice and social injustice, and we need to define vulnerability, I think, in several dimensions in order to grasp it in a more adequate way without just labeling people. Yeah, maybe if you like to ask some more questions, what you want to specifically hear, because I've not heard what you discussed before, so that I don't repeat it.
Yes, now you have a question with you again, because you work in a Department of Medicine, or you belong to healthcare. Yes.
Yes, I have a background in healthcare in the sense that I have a professional background in nursing. I've worked as a nurse, and I later on studied philosophy, and then looked very much into questions of ethics in medicine, ethics in healthcare, and I'm now at the Institute of Ethics and History of Health and Society at the Medical Faculty of the University of Augsburg.
Perfect. Now my question is that in health sciences, that is considered as more objective science as compared to social science, they might have a very technocratic framework to define who is vulnerable. So in that sense, how do the healthcare professionals, or even the people who are deciding on the ethics, how do they see that when a medical system, define vulnerability as very objective term, and they frame people on different level of health scale and then consider them as vulnerable, Do you think that this is a technocratic framing of the concept?
Well, yes, it's a bit of a question whether you ask how it is being done. So I describe the clinical realities, or whether it ought to be done in a different way. And I think, of course, there will always be, exceptions, maybe in different fields of medicine, like psychology, psychiatry, I think is partly quite a different discourse and maybe a different awareness and a different conception of healthcare, because they already look more at like social medicine and social determinants of health. And maybe some other parts of medicine are much more biomedically oriented. And I think, yes, it is maybe more technocratic, but I would focus more even on an understanding of vulnerability that comes from biomedical knowledge. And that is very important and it's very valuable knowledge, but it's not the only one. And I think the problem is often in medical treatment, and in medicine, that the biomedical focus is very strong and it does not look so much at social determinants of health. While we know from health sciences that the medical treatment is an important, but only one determinant of health, and other determinants of health and the social gaps and social inequalities play a huge role. And that's why I think maybe in medicine, often we even talk more about risk. At least that's what I perceive here in Germany. It's more a talk about who is at risk of developing certain diseases, and risk and vulnerability are linked and interlinked, of course, but they're not quite the same. And that's another question I think that would be important to look at and to try and understand what are the differences, between danger, risk, vulnerability. I think there we use these words and concepts without really clearly thinking about why we use risk or why we use vulnerability. It's sometimes interchangeable and is not always clarified. And I think when we look at different dimensions of vulnerability, that can also help, because of course there is a type of being prone, to certain diseases or being at risk, in that sense, being vulnerable, maybe because of reasons that are very much tied to your body, in the sense of to your maybe to the abilities you have and the ones you don't have because of simply physical biomedical diseases or health status or what. But that is only one level of vulnerability that and then there is another level that is situational, one could say, and one that is structural. And in feminist bioethics, there's a very nice suggestion that so far I still find one of the most well reflected on one side. It's theoretically quite well founded, and at the same time I could imagine it's also really good for practical contexts, like in the clinical context. That is from Mackenzie et al. And they develop a taxonomy of vulnerability, and they look at it in a way that they say, okay, there is this inherent level. These are intrinsic vulnerabilities that we all share as human beings. Simply, we are human beings who have a body, who can fall sick, who can get injured, who can have accidents, and we all share that. And then within that, there are people who maybe because of a disease they acquired or they were born with, are even more vulnerable. But there is a basic vulnerability that we all share as human beings. And then there's another layer of situational vulnerability. So that depends on maybe your life situation. If you have maybe due to your biography, a phase that is extremely stressful, or a transition period, or whatever the situation may be, that can make you more vulnerable to certain things for a certain period of time, but doesn't mean that it's like that forever. And here you can also have like structural vulnerabilities coming in depending on the situation you live in, your economic situation, your social environment, and so on. Political aspects can even come in. And then they call something pathogenic vulnerability, and that goes along with situations of abuse, that are particularly dangerous. And in some ways, like the situational and the pathogenic vulnerability is something that I would say you could use the term. It doesn't sound very like a good word, but at the same time, to vulnerabilize people, you make them vulnerable. It's not that that's something that lies within them or is their fault or anything like that. It is situations and structures that can make you vulnerable, and it can, and it's beyond the person to change that. And I think that's very important that we look at those kind of vulnerabilities or processes of making people vulnerable much, much more.
Is there anything that we can say social vulnerability? Because in the context of migration, I have seen that when people are seen as excluded or they experience social exclusion, they are seen as more vulnerable as compared to the people who are included. So do you think that social vulnerability might be a thing, or we should define some way social vulnerability? My question to Sylvia first.
I think I would prefer talking about structural vulnerability, and there are already concepts for structural vulnerability because that includes the social and the political and the economic, and it's very much interlinked. These levels, the social level is very much interlinked with questions of economy, inclusion, exclusion, and it kind of expresses in different ways. And the structural is in a way also a bit, maybe for philosophers in many ways, dissatisfying because it's so unclear. It's such a broad term and it can be anything. But I think one can also make it clearer. And in some of the concepts that already exist, it is also described, that it has to do with, economic structures, with rules and regulations, even by a law. For example, if you take the example of refugees, there are laws that then will determine what kind of healthcare you have access to, and then on top of that, you have a certain economic situation. And on top of this, you have problems maybe in the social, in the sense of how people interact and whether they are ready to, make the effort to overcome language barriers, or whether economically translation and interpreters are being paid for. And then again, all these things, regulations, are political decisions. So it's very much interlinked. But I think we can see that there are processes of sometimes very ambiguous inclusion-exclusion processes that are on all these levels, of politics, law, social, and then kind of determine the clinical practice and the access and the kind of healthcare that people can have or not.
Yeah, so social vulnerability may be seen as an element or component of structural vulnerability, where it is more connected. Okay, now Zeliha, in this context, do you think that you have done a study on migrants as well in the study in which you talk about social resilience? I think you also talk about migrants in that study. So how do you see this concept of social vulnerability as a structural vulnerability in that study?
Yes. Yeah, I agree with Sylvia, because that social, when we are talking just social, we may not see the root causes, the real causes of the social factors. It's social is, I think it's a little bit more naive or politically more clear concept is social. But if we are saying the stigmatization, it's not so much dangerous. But why are some people stigmatized? Because of anti-discrimination and because of racism. But we are not saying, we are not using racism. It's because it's very political. And that's why people are using this stigmatization. Or we are saying migrants, but we are always neglecting that why are migrants there in that countries? Because there are conflicts, war in their countries. And why we have war in these countries? Just a conflict between two parts? Or is it a neoliberal, or it's a capitalist, or it's a patriarchal, it's or imperialist? We should discuss all of this together. That's why I wouldn't prefer to say, of course, the social are also important, but we shouldn't neglect the real causes of vulnerabilities. And that's why I would prefer structural, or maybe there is another term for this, a better term. And also, I can add something that classifying vulnerable people as vulnerable, and this is also very dangerous. Maybe we can classify people according to their biomedical situations, but of course it doesn't mean that they are very vulnerable. They are open to, as I gave the example of people with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I would like to, but we should focus on vulnerability mechanisms, on people's lives, and who are more open to these vulnerability mechanisms, and who are more protected with from these vulnerability mechanisms. For example, a young Turkish woman told me this story that I asked her, she is living in Germany, did you feel sometimes in your childhood to be discriminated? And she said, no one could be discriminated. They were telling me some very funny jokes, not funny, bad jokes, but I was fighting with them and I was giving the answer and I was not vulnerable. But she was open, she was vulnerable to discrimination, but she had an individual resilience, but the discrimination was there. And there was actually no social protection or no social resilience mechanisms. There was nothing in the school that is protecting her from being discriminated on, from being center of the jokes. And it's sometimes they are matching, but sometimes not so much.
Do you think that vulnerability, if it is recognized by the people who are so-called named as or labeled as vulnerable, if the vulnerability is somehow recognized, it can be used as a resource or as a strength?
Yeah, it's important to not to classify people as vulnerable, but it's important to see these vulnerability mechanisms. And sometimes migrants are also not aware of these mechanisms. And sometimes they are thinking, oh, it was a discrimination actually. And or it was a vulnerability mechanisms that we should be aware of this in order to bring all these communities together to struggle with this. And also for the host communities, they are sometimes not aware of this, that if we are talking, of course, on the case of migrants, there are also some other cases, but in the when we are talking on migrants, the host communities, they are also not always aware of the structural vulnerability mechanisms that migrants are facing. And that's why I think, I don't know if it was the answer of your question, but we should make these mechanisms obvious, very clear.
Yeah, in a way, I think you are right that there should be a mechanism to recognize the vulnerabilities, particularly with reference to the structure. Sylvia, do you think that because whenever we talk about vulnerability, we see it as a negative thing, and when we say resilience, we see it as a positive thing. It's a very general opinion, but also these two terms are used within the concept of crisis or within the framework of crisis. So do you think that resilience and vulnerability are only possible or only evident when there is crisis, or without crisis we can make meanings of these terms?
Yeah, I definitely think we can make meaning of these terms without crisis. Well, it also depends a bit on what you understand with crisis, but I really do think both of them are, you can look at it, as the basic condition of human life. And I mean, in the whole discussion on vulnerability, there are like two or maybe three different positions, because you can look at vulnerability as something that is like part of our human condition, on a very basic, very essential level. When it's like reflecting on what does it mean to be a human being. Part of it is that we are very fragile, and that we die one day. We are fragile, we are vulnerable, and that is something we don't invent. We just it's like an insight that you find when you reflect on what does it mean to live as a human being. So one part of this human condition is being vulnerable. Some researchers don't like using vulnerability in that sense because they say it's too broad, and then it will not help us to find out who needs special protection, because very often concepts of vulnerability are about, I think with a very good motivation to say, look, let's find out who needs more support, who needs protection first. But then it also becomes a bit tricky, because then it's about the distribution of resources, about prioritization, and even though it's meant well, it then becomes difficult, because then you can find all sorts of reasons why everybody is vulnerable, and then everybody comes first. And then again, the question, who is talking about who, and why? So yeah, there's an argument to say, look, it's a basic human condition. There's an argument to say, no, we need to attach it to very special, conditions, so that we can make the differences and see who needs support most. And then there is the option, and I think this is what Mackenzie and her colleagues are trying in their taxonomy of vulnerability, and it's also a position that I would prefer, is to say it's both. It's really both. It is a human condition that we all share, and if we get aware of this, I think it can help us to also become aware of the fact that we may have a very privileged position. So it's not only the others who are vulnerable. I'm also vulnerable. But what is it that protects me? And then I can begin to reflect and see, wow, for example, for me as a white woman in an academic position, I'm very much protected. I have lots of privilege, and others are more vulnerable, not because they are and not because of their persons, not because it's an intrinsic thing, but because they have a different social position. And so I think if we combine the awareness of vulnerability as a human condition with the structural and very specific situational factors that can make people vulnerable, I think that's helpful. And then we come to reflect about very, very essential problems like racism. And I'm glad, Zeliha, you mentioned it, because I really think we don't talk about it enough yet, and we're not aware about it enough yet. And there's a lot to learn. And especially, in Germany, I think it's a lot of shying away from talking about race and racism. But I think it's something that has begun to change a bit in recent years, and that we need to look into much more, because I think it's at the core of many of the problems we are talking, both concerning vulnerability and resilience.
Sylvia, you just gave a beautiful example that being a white person and having academic position, it helps you to think that, okay, you have privileges and then you are less vulnerable as compared to some other people. But do you think, and of course, I think you have just mentioned racism, and that is a concept that would relate to vulnerabilities as well, might be. Because when you say that being a white, you get some privileges, it means that somehow the concepts from race, they determine the position that make you less vulnerable as compared to other in a society. Do you think that these concepts also contribute to the conceptualization of vulnerability?
Yeah. It's difficult to I'm still struggling. I've not found a good solution on how to cope with, you know, a concept like race, because we know biologically it doesn't exist. We are talking about something that does not exist, but yet in the social interactions and in structural, political, and so on, of course it exists. Racism exists. So let's put it that way. Yeah, and it's, I think, racist ideas that invent races, because yeah, we know now that the differences, genetic differences, are minor. It's you know, phenotypes that are different, and they have nothing to do with they should have nothing to do with whether people are vulnerable or not, but they do because of political and social power constructions. And of course, in that way, I think whether they are aware or not, whether it's intentional racism or not, you know, I think there's a lot of, I mean, I certainly can say that in my socialization, I learned a lot of racist, let me put it in quotes, knowledge, because it's wrong knowledge. But all the stereotypes, the pictures, the you know, hierarchies, it's there, and it's very it's in all levels. It's on very subtle levels, but it's also on sometimes very, very explicit and very outspoken. And I think it's a big task, you know, to try and discover your own your own knowledge, or what you have learned and what that does to you, and the way you react to other person, or the fact that, you know, as a white person, you will talk about others as black or colored or whatever, but you don't talk about yourself as being white. So that's the whole issue of critical whiteness. And I think that's really a challenge we need to face, you know, to discover the racist setup of our societies, and the way in which racist ideas are kind of filtered actually into everything. And we can see it. I mean, the studies are even there. The empirical research is there, you know, about social inequalities. When you think of housing, of employment, you know, we can see that social inequalities very much run along lines of racialization. And of course, this has an effect on health, and racism is one of the social determinants of health, I would say. And so definitely it has to do with vulnerability, and it makes people absolutely much more vulnerable, which does not mean that they themselves are not very, as you said, resilient and strong persons, you know. But it's a whole socio-political, historically grown, old racist setup of our societies, in the global north, let me say. That's the position I'm talking from, and that's something. I'm glad it's beginning to be more discussed. Let me say that, and it's still a long way to go.
Yes, and I think we all three somehow are, well, I mean, there is no consensus on the definition of crisis, risk, or vulnerability. And I think there should be no consensus. Universal consensus does not solve the problems. But one thing that seems to be on consensus is that the context is very important. How do you define crisis, vulnerability, and risk? They must be contextualized as well, so that we can frame things better towards a solution. Now, to conclude things, I know that maybe Sylvia, you have not worked on social resilience exclusively, but if I would just ask you to connect social and resilience together, how they make sense in the term social resilience, can you share some thoughts?
I can't really share very founded thoughts on this because I've really not worked on this issue of resilience, not in research. But the questions I would like to understand, or the questions I would like to ask, and the kind of things I would like to understand about social resilience is what is it that can help maybe in smaller units of the social, like in communities, in setups like schools, and where there is social life, there seem to be some factors that kind of strengthen people, both as individual and as group. And that link between what can strengthen individuals, but that at the same time can strengthen the community, that I would be interested in. And I find it quite intriguing that, we can see that societies where you have more inequalities are altogether worse off than societies that have less inequalities, even if the richest of the rich are not as rich as the ones, with more inequality. So this question, what happens to the vulnerability and the resilience of individuals and of groups and of communities, depending on how much equality or inequality there is, I find that very, very interesting. I would like to understand more about that. These are kind of some questions also for resilience. What does resilience have to do with the way people live together, and with the way inequalities are more or less there.
Yeah, this is an interesting question actually, because then we can realize that just like you said, that if a society is rich but it has inequalities, it would be worse than a society that is not rich but they have equalities. So it means that economic well-being is not all that can help people to be resilient, or a society to be named as a financially resilient or economically resilient society. And that is a big question actually. Zeliha, what do you think if I would ask you to give me a definition of, I know that you talk about critical social resilience as well, but how do you like to define social resilience?
I would like to define first the elimination of structural vulnerability mechanisms, or if we call it vulnerability mechanisms, or I don't know which terminology is the best, but in the absence of barriers to resources, that the equal access for each person. And of course, equality is important, but we are not equal. We have also some inherent disadvantages, or the health situations, or the different backgrounds, and that for this person, this kind of groups, the presence of publicly and well-organized support, I think these are there are two aspects: without barriers, and for those who are still experiencing barriers, that's extra support. But I don't mean this social that the communities in between other, just the solidarity mechanisms, that the solidarity between people is very, very important, and we saw it during the pandemic, and it began in the first weeks of the pandemic, the solidarity, but in the beginning, in the middle of the process, it was not working. But on the other side, the civil society organizations that were well organized before the pandemic, or NGOs, after the first crisis, after the first, what we are going to do, and maybe then in a couple of weeks, they said, okay, since they had resources and the previous experiences, then they continue to support people. That's why I think that even the country even people are very rich. The most important thing is that how public supporting all these people who can be left behind, or how they are not leaving people behind. And I think the pandemic was a very important, the crisis situations. This social resilience is not unique to crisis situations, but from this pandemic, we learned a lot. We learned which mechanisms are not working. These mechanisms, when they are not well structured, the solidarity between neighbors, okay, they are good, but you cannot trust them. You can just trust these publicly funded and well-established mechanisms, I think, and that's why I see this public focus very in the center of social resilience. My theory, in my social resilience understanding.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think this pandemic, though it was a big crisis, but in a way it was a blessing in disguise, that it put to test all the global social systems and political systems, and every structure was put to test. Even we as human beings were put to test, and communities. And yes, it has left with several unanswered questions, with new conceptualizations, and also with solutions, just like you said, that people learned a lot. And that's why social resilience is emerging now, a concept, because it is coming out of the studies from the crisis, from the migration crisis, and other complexities in this field. Well, I learned a lot, actually. And if I will just try to sum it up, two things that I have learned from you and Sylvia, that context is very important. None of these terms, even they are chained together, risk, vulnerability, and resilience, none of these terms are out of context. And whenever we want to write something, and even we want to research something, we have to contextualize it. And second, I think we cannot have a yardstick to measure risk and resilience and vulnerabilities as a universal thing. And Sylvia, that context is very important. None of these terms, even they are chained together, risk, vulnerability, and resilience, none of these terms are out of context. And whenever we want to write something, and even we want to research something, we have to contextualize it. And second, I think we cannot have a yardstick to measure risk and resilience and vulnerabilities as a universal thing. And also that not the economic resilience is not enough, because I have seen that when we talk about migrants' integration in the countries like Sweden and other countries, they are too much focused on economic equalities. But then somehow we put the structure equalities and social justice under the table. And that makes sense, that not always economic equality is not always a solution to help people foster social resilience. I hope you agree with my summary. Or you want to add something, Zeliha?
No, I was saying thank you for your summary.
Yes, and Sylvia, you want to add, or it is a fine summary?
It's a fine summary. Maybe the only little thing is I'm beginning to think that it's very important that we as researchers really reflect on our position, because it's from our positions that we will then make definitions about who's vulnerable and resilient, what it means, and that I think we really have to have this self-reflection, onto our position and why we are asking which questions and using which definitions and what that actually means, this position as a researcher, how neutral it can be, and or that we should make it very transparent to ourselves and to others. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Zeliha, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you very much for your nice invitation. And it was
Yes.
a pleasure for me also.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you.